Now to more breaking news this afternoon. The Albanese government has granted hundreds of temporary visas to Palestinians since the October 7 terror attacks. Anthony Albanese has provided 860 visas for Palestinians who aren't Australian citizens to come to Australia between October 7 and November 20th. 860. The ABC reports, and I quote, the Australian government has granted hundreds of temporary visas to Palestinians in the weeks since Israel began its bombing campaign of Gaza, which has killed thousands of civilians and flattened large swaths of the densely populated strip. Now, Foreign Minister Penny Wong held a press conference this afternoon and she claimed that security checks were being done on these 860 people.
Well, again, I go back to this. People who obtain Australian visas are subject to appropriate security checks, and these people have been subjected to the same security checks by Australian Border Force and authorities, as you would expect any visa applicant would be required.
She then called for the next steps towards a sustainable ceasefire. She said she remains deeply concerned about the loss of civilian life. Well, given the Albanese government has just allowed rapists and murderers onto our streets without any real precautions until they were forced by Peter Dutton into legislation to put ankle bracelets on them, you can be forgiven for questioning their security process and having no confidence that they're actually doing proper security checks. This government is clearly weak on national security. Now, those granted visas might be innocent Palestinians. They might be. But what security checks are being done to make sure they don't have links to Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or other terror groups? The visas have already been granted between October 7 and November 20, just a couple of days ago. So the security process can't have been that vigorous if they were rushed through. The Albanese government seems to have lost its mind on national security. We need to ask what checks are being done to make sure that these Palestinians share our Australian values and aren't going to be importing any hatred of Jews from the front line of the war onto our safe Australian streets. Well, here was the Shadow Immigration Minister Dan Tehan making this point today.
The government needs to come out, be transparent and let us know what processes have been undertaken, on what basis have the visas been granted and whether the proper security checks have been undertaken. That would be the type of information that the Australian people would rightly expect from a government. But once again, all we're learning is via the media, and we need transparency, and especially transparency around whether all the proper processes were undertaken, especially the proper security checks.
So let's be clear, these 860 are not Australian citizens. The government already brought home Australian citizens and permanent residents. The Department of Home Affairs says that the 860 visas have been approved for Palestinians with connections to Australia. So what does that mean? Does it mean they visited here? They know someone who's here? The government hasn't been clear about this. And these are Palestinians from the front line of the war. How do we know that some of them may not be Hamas? I'm sorry, but when we're already experiencing strong anti-Semitism on our streets, we have to take steps to ensure that we aren't importing more hatred into Australia. We don't want our Jewish children further at risk from anyone who's been at the very front line of this brutal conflict. The idea that all Palestinians are innocent civilians is naive. Of course, many of them are unwitting victims of Hamas, and they need to be rescued from Hamas, as Jonathan Conricker said. But others agree with the hatred. Others have been pictured celebrating terror attacks against Israel. Others gathered round a Jewish woman as she was dragged through the streets of Hamas on October 7th. There is no doubt that some children in Gaza and the West Bank are brought up to hate Jews. They're indoctrinated. This isn't the way Israelis and Jews are raised, to hate. This is an insult by the Albanese government not to be taking proper security precautions. Anthony Albanese visited the Holocaust Museum today in Melbourne, speaking about anti-Semitism, but then he's allowing nearly 1,000 people into Australia from the front line of Gaza. Has he considered what this might do to anti-Semitism in this country if rigorous security checks aren't done? Does he think this is going to make our lives safer and more secure? The Australian, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council Executive Director Dr. Colin Rubenstein told me in a statement that Australia has a long tradition of providing temporary visas and other similar visas, and that should continue, especially for civilians at risk. But the community needs to be assured that thorough and proper security and safety checks will be undertaken regardless of their origin. That is a basic principle of a robust and viable immigration system. He says the community will want to know who is selecting the candidates for the visas and who is doing the security screening. He says given that Gaza is a territory whose governing authority is a murderous, listed terrorist organisation in Australia, detailed scrutiny would seem to be required to ensure Hamas activists and supporters, or even worse, Hamas terrorists, are not inadvertently admitted into Australia. Now, again, these visas, 860 given from October 7, the date of the terror attacks, to November 20. The question needs to be asked whether Hamas is trawling through their social media, their phone messages, their internet use to make sure some of them don't have terror allegiances. Albanese could be providing safe passage to Australia for Hamas terrorists who Israeli media reports are melting away from Gaza. It's extremely worrying. We have every right to be concerned, and you'd be forgiven for having no faith that our government will, especially under the hapless Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles, be making sure that terrorist sympathisers and anti-Semites aren't being flown right into our peaceful cities at a time when already anti-Semitism is a major problem, an epidemic. Albanese needs to do more, in my opinion, to show he cares about this issue of anti-Semitism, not just words, but action. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so quickly, without time for security screening, be welcoming with open arms nearly 1,000 people who are not Australian citizens.